Again for the recording, welcome everybody, and welcome to the third and the final pre-Zoom session for the 2023 series for garlic growing. And today we're going to focus on that last stage of post-planting, all the way through the growth stage, the bulbing stage, the scaping, harvesting, and the curing stage. So let's have a look at what we're going to do. But first of all, just a little bit about me in case you haven't been to the other ones. Sort of feel a little bit strange, keep talking about me. But I have had 20 years of growing garlic. 10 years of those have been in broadacre certified organic production of about 25 tonne up to the Sydney and Melbourne markets, and particularly focusing on the long storing and the late harvesting that really hit the market when all of the other garlic was depleted. After that, I really started focusing on seed production and seed quality and breeding programs. And that's what I've been doing for about 11 years. Very focused on plant nutrition, very focused also on pest and disease, specifically to do with garlic. And we've lost a lot of that knowledge in the industry. It's why I've actually put out 2 guides over the last couple of years, because I kept talking with my commercial growers that I was consulting to and realizing that they didn't have a visual of what I was speaking for. And when we were doing plant and crop management and monitoring, I found there just wasn't enough visual information for them available on the internet or in any reference book that really showed the life cycle of the diseases from its very initial stage all the way through to its very advanced stage. This is just the first one that's come out. They're finding it very good, and I'm really pleased with that. I think there's probably going to be another one coming out. But that, in terms of consulting and also breeding garlics, which is a really tedious and very long process, takes about 7 years to bring out a new breed, has been really exciting for me. So this is part of what I'm focusing on at the moment. Today, we are going to have a look at the garlic life cycle. And we didn't talk about that as part of the agenda, but we can't speak about this last phase without understanding the different stages that garlic is going to go through. And it's really important, because this helps us to understand its nutritional and its climate demand, and it also allows us to understand the vulnerabilities of when the main pest and disease stages occur and how to manage those. We're going to talk specifically about winter management, and it's going to change by the different climate types, and I'm going to show you what that is and why, whenever we're on any type of social media group or any other information sharing platform, we really have to know where a person is and what their climate is and what their garlic is before we can really comment in any way about what is normal and what's not normal, or what's going to be their risks that they're facing. And then we're going to have a look at a growth pattern, just example to show something like a turban, which is one of the most common garlics grown in Australia, of what a turban would look like in a warm climate versus a cool climate. And it is really different. We're going to talk about fertilising and watering during the growth and bulbing stages, and it's going to be different for both. Scaping, harvesting, and then obviously curing, which is the final stage. So let's get into that and see how we go. Now, I'm really good for diagrams. I love diagrams, and this is one of the best ones that came out by a German company that studied the different life cycle of garlic, and they've mapped that out. I don't think everything is precise in it, but it's a good one to use. So let's have a look at it. I find that garlic has 6 distinct phases in it. And those 6 distinct phases are very specific in terms of what the plant is doing and its vulnerability, its nutrient demands and its vulnerability to pest and disease. Down here, those life cycle stages are the first stage, which is germination. It will root first, that's its preference, and then it will shoot afterwards. And that's if we haven't left it too long, if we're planting at the right stage, when that shoot is 2/3 of the way up the clove, when it is planted, will root first. The first thing it does is establish its water and nutrient source, and then it'll actually start to produce the shoots. This can happen in as short as 2 days for a turban type of garlic, which is very rapidly shooting, or it could take up to 6 weeks for something like a rocambole that really needs to sit in the soil and get that accumulated chill factor before it'll actually germinate. They always panic me, those rocamboles. The next stage is seedling, and it's this clustered or clumped set of leaves that come out of a very small area. It's pre-winter, and this is what happens with most of the garlics, that they'll actually put out between 3 to 4 leaves, and it's clustered. So it's this really type of hand shape, design of leaves. The juvenile stage is where we no longer have this short seedling cluster. It's normally over winter and warmer climates, or it's in spring and a cooler climate. And we're starting to see a little bit of what we call stem elongation. So the gap between the leaves is starting to open up. The height of the plant is increasing. The number of leaves is increasing. We are losing the clove remnant during that time frame. So the shoot that's grown up through the clove is now actually the main plant, and the remainder of that clove tissue is now degraded and actually dissolved into the soils. We might even at that stage have one leaf that's starting to die back, because as that plant starts to elongate and grow, it also grows wider. And that small first leaf that came out was there when the stem was very small. And as that plant starts to expand, that stem and that leaf gets split and it will die off. And that's typically what we call the 5 to 6 leaf stage. It's that early spring or that warm winter growing period. The maturing stage, and it sounds funny to say maturing when it's only 7 to 8 leaves, but that is the maturing of the growth stage of the garlic. It's when we have a good 8 leaves. It's when we're getting a nice tall plant. The whole plant at this stage isn't fully mature when most people would think about it with the scape. But in terms of the plant growth stage, this is actually the maturing. The plant gets taller, the leaves get wider, the leaves get longer. You'll normally get maybe a second leaf that will start to die off because the stem is certainly thickening. And it's the very first stage or the last stage in that growth period before we end up in this transitioning phase. And that's because the plant is transitioning between growth, as in putting on more leaves, and preparing to actually create a bulb in the bottom. And the first stage of that transition is this swelling of the stem area. This is technically called a stem. And it swells like an onion. And if you have a look at the photograph up here, that's what it'll look like. It's not actually just this straight stem anymore. We've now got these really thickened layers in here. There's no cloves. They're just swelling and it's thickening. You can still eat this. It's lovely and garlicky tasting. But this is the stage where the plant is still putting on more leaves, and it will put on more leaves, but those leaves are now what we call the fertile leaves. So the 11th and 12th leaf are actually the leaves in which, in the actual stem itself, cloves are being created. Can you see these tiny little cloves in that fertile leaf? So the 11th leaf will have one set of cloves, and the 12th leaf will have another set of cloves. It's why we say there's always 2 fertile leaves for hardnecks, and softnecks actually have 3 fertile leaves. So for softnecks, they use the 10th leaf as their first clove leaf, and then they use the 11th and the 12th as their second and third clove layers inside of the bulb. And at that stage, when those cloves are initiated, it's called when they're tiny little nodules, the scape, if it is a hardneck, starts to grow from the base and up. So by the time that you see the scape coming out of the top of the plant, it's been bulbing in terms of those cloves have been initiated for about a week and a half to 2 weeks. It takes about a week and a half to 2 weeks for that scape to come from the bottom of the stem all the way and be visible outside of the top of the plant itself. At that stage, when we've got that scape appearing, the plant actually won't produce any more leaves. That's the mature plant fully, not only mature in terms of the terminal number of leaves, but it's now transitioning into bulbing, and in fact, it's going to transition into dying back. And so we have these 2 stages, one of the bulbing one, which is what we call clove initiation. Again, it's when those cloves are formed and the scape starts to develop. And then the final stage is really the swelling stage. It's when all of the cloves are now present. We're actually starting to get dieback, where the lower leaves are transferring nutrient into the bulb, and that bulb is starting to swell and the cloves are starting to swell. At that same stage, the actual scape will start to uncoil and stand up. It becomes woody. And this is really the optimal stage of where we want to harvest. We'll get on to that harvest definition in terms of premium, but technically it's 4.5 green leaves remaining for a hardneck and 6 remaining green leaves for a softneck. If we left it too much further, we lose the number of outside bulb skins that are required for that bulb to remain very viable during its long storage life. And we might get a bigger clove parcel and cluster, but we certainly wouldn't have all of the bulb skins on those cloves. And the bulb structure would be more open and it wouldn't store longer, both because the bulb structure is open and because we've lost a lot of those protective leaves. So there really is an optimal stage of when we actually want to harvest our bulbs, when we have a really lovely mature bulb and when we have lots of wrappers, at least 3 wrappers on that bulb, that's going to keep it in great storage. Now, some climates, we do get a different number of leaves. In our very warm climate up in Queensland, we might find that those turbans and subtropicals might actually produce sometimes 13 or 14, or a really big plant might even produce 16 leaves. And that's unusual, but it can happen. So warmer climates can produce more leaves, and you'll get to know really quickly when you do your leaf counting how many leaves on average your large plants will produce. And we do count the dead leaves, by the way. So we'll always go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 leaves on this plant. Warm temperate to cool temperate will be somewhere normally around the 12 leaves, which is why I'm always talking about it. In the really cool end, it might go down to 10 for some of the garlics. I still get 12 leaves on all of my garlics. And in the really cold climate, we talk about the snow climates, the frozen ground climates, Northern America, Canada, those garlics will only produce 8 to 10 leaves. Very common even to have 8 leaves on porcelains. But we're talking about how many leaves is normal for the plant to mature before we get the clove initiation stage. And we do get some variability. On average, 80% of us in the largest growing climate will probably have about 12 leaves for a large clove plant. Now, when we talk about this stage of maturing and these different life cycle stages, there's also different risk stages, and these are pest and disease risks. The first one is really obvious. When we've planted it in the ground, if that clove was diseased, if it had a significant issue with it, we're going to see it at the seedling stage. And we'll see it really obvious because there will be other plants that will be really healthy and growing large, and there will be plants that are really struggling, and you'll see them with paler leaves and stunted, and they're really struggling. And I always would rogue those out. It means culling, removing them, because if they are stunted, if they are retarded, they're never going to produce a healthy bulb. They have a risk of actually infecting surrounding plants and neighboring plants. And they also have that risk of infecting the soil. So if something is really struggling, it's best to just rogue it, to cull it, and to remove it out. This stage, from what we call juvenile to the 7th to 8th leaf stage, if they've survived the seedling stage, they're normally very healthy. As long as you've got good soils, the plants are very, very healthy because they're in full-on growth mode. Their immune systems are incredibly strong. They've got nothing in terms of any type of issues in terms of disease at this stage because they are so robust and so strong. It's when we get to this transitioning phase of when the plant has now only got 2 more leaves to put on, which are going to be the fertile leaves. It's starting to do this swelling of the stem, and it's starting to get ready to die back, that its immune system starts to actually become compromised. It's actively starting to prepare for dying back. And when it does that, it's going to withdraw the nutrients from the leaves. And as it starts to withdraw the nutrients from the leaves into the bulb, the immune system of the plant is vulnerable. And this is typically when we'll see things like garlic rust start to affect a plant because it really no longer has that really strong immune system. It's when we get to this stage of when the bulb is starting to really mature that high volumes of water around that maturing bulb start to introduce serious issues to do with fusarium, which is basal plate issues, and other types of issues related to excess water. So here the plant is really expecting, just moist soils. It's expecting warm and dry conditions, and excess water at that stage really does, ignite quite a lot of the pest and disease issues. So we know that this is the first stage in seedling. We know that we get this really great growth and easy, happy plants up to about 8th leaf. And we really know from about 9th leaf on, right to the end, we've got to probably be more monitoring and more careful with it. And I'll talk about one of the treatments that can be used as a protection and preventative treatment later on. Talk about now the difference in our basic climates, because we all sort of live on Facebook and we have this garlic groups and they're fantastic. But many of us that live in these different climates don't realize the difference that we can have in these major climates and how even the same garlic will grow differently in these different climates. So I've given you two weather charts just to demonstrate either Casino, New South Wales, and you can see that this is the average daytime temperature, the average nighttime temperature, and then the bands behind it are really the extremes of the daytimes and the extremes of the night times. And here's this green line that's running through. And the green line indicates what we call the just growth line. 12 degrees Cs is when we just get minimal growth. And so above 12 degrees Cs, anywhere 14 to 18, you've got nice growth. Below 12 degrees, you get no growth. We call it dormancy, or such tiny amounts of growth that it's almost not visible. So if we were in Geeveston down in Tasmania, and during the winter, you can see their overnights are sitting down below 5 degrees. You can see the daytimes are sitting almost right on that borderline of 10. In fact, they're warmer than me. My winter days are down between 5 and 8 degrees for about 3 months. So I get no growth over winter. Geeveston would probably get no growth during these 2 months, and only tiny bits of growth you can see on the beginning of those. And of course, it's a very slow spring and actually a very cool summer as well. Compared to that, we've got Casino in New South Wales, and of course their winter temperatures overnight might be down below towards the 5 degrees. So they do get very cool nights, but their daytime temperatures in winter are up around and above 20 degrees centigrade. And that really means that they're going to get really good continued growth during winter. And that makes such a difference, because in cool climates, when you get winter days that are below that 12 degrees, we get no growth, and we might get no growth for up to 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 12 weeks. But climates that have, those lovely 18 plus degree days during winter means that they'll get continued growth all the way through winter. And it means that their plants will be maturing earlier and faster in late spring or even early summer compared to those cooler climates. It does make a really dramatic difference. And I think that's why if I've spoken to you at all and you've asked about advice, I would always look at a climate chart to understand what your winter is doing, and then what your spring is doing, and then how hot is your summer as to which garlics might match and what they're going to do in those types of climates. Let's just sort of consolidate that. We do have these warm climate patterns, so we get some growth in autumn, we get full growth in winter, and we're going to get an early harvesting in spring in the warm climates, northern New South Wales, Queensland. In the temperate and cools, we'll get no growth during winter. So we get some in autumn, no growth during winter. It's a slow spring, so most of our garlic is going to harvest later, maybe in late spring, but really in summer most of the times. And in those cold frozen climates, for which we have no growers in Australia like this, but to give you that full picture, if we were in Northern America, in Canada, we would actually get no growth in prior to winter. And in fact, they plant in about 3 to 4 weeks before what's called the freeze. And that freeze, or that 3 to 4 weeks that they plant before, is only to get the roots out, to allow the roots to emerge. It does not shoot. They only produce roots, and their garlic behaves like a spring flower. So it will remain with roots during that frozen solid ground snow period. And then in spring, we will see the shoots come out, and they will actually bulb very quickly, and plants will grow very quickly with only 8 leaves. So that vernalization, that deep cold, actually gives that spring growth, amazing spring growth that we don't achieve because we just don't get that depth of winter. To let you know, the rest of the world actually can have 2 types of garlics that can be spring planted. And this is done over in Europe with Creoles and Silverskins. Both of these guys are 12-month storers. And in areas where it is way too wet, too cold, and too long of a winter, they're planted in the last month of winter. And so they grow very happily into spring. They get the last chill that they need, a very short 5 to 6 weeks of that last winter conditions. They're sprouting and germinating in spring, and out they come. and finish a little bit later in the summer. And those European regions rarely get above 30 degrees. So these creoles and silver scans can be successfully planted in late winter, ready for early spring, but they are a smaller bulb because of that. But it's an option. It can be done. I just wanted to sort of give you a picture again, because most of us, when we're thinking about maybe growing 1 or 2 garlics, can't imagine what they look like all at the same time. So here's a snapshot for you. It's my garlic. It's on the 29th of August. So, technically it's on the verge of spring. And I'm still sitting in my temperatures down here, where the overnights are 5 to 6 degrees in the end of August, and my daytime temperatures have just tickled that 12 to 13 degrees sometimes. My subtropicals in my greenhouse are fully mature by this stage. They are bulbing, they have their full set of leaves, they're lovely and happy and green. My turbans that are outside, these are some of my outside beds, not my main beds, these are my breeding beds. But you can see that the turbans that are the earliest harvesting in the temperate climate garlics are at 9 leaves, but they're really clustered still. They're still in that really stunted, clustered arrangement. So they haven't got into that full maturing stage. The Asiatics, which are also a cooler climate one, have 6 leaves, so less leaves. And when we get into the mid-season garlics, you can see they're right back to that 3 to 4 leaves. There is just nothing other than this seedling stage for these mid-season garlics, because it's just too cold for them. And if we go to those late season garlics, they're even looking spindlier and smaller, because again, their growth for those late season garlics are not going to start until after 14 degrees days. So we've got this really big difference between, the warmer, loving climate garlics that have an earlier growth system, and the mid-season and late season garlics where their growth is later in the spring season because of that. But it does mean when you're speaking to anybody, if your winter climate growing conditions are incredibly important as to what their growth pattern is going to be. Let's talk about the common question, which is, how often do I water? Or do I need to keep feeding garlic? And I think one of the first things that it helps me to speak to people about is the fact that this is not a 100-day crop. We often talk about tomatoes, if they're an 80-day crop, a 100-day crop, 120-day crop. This is a crop that's going to be growing for 7 to 9 months. And we're going to plant it in autumn. We're going to get normally quite a lot of rain during winter or early spring. That's going to leach some of the nutrient out of the soil. So we're going, even the manures and the fertilizers we've put in before planting, we're going to lose a lot of that during winter. It does have a huge growth demand during that stage where it's coming out of that initial seedling stage and into maturity. And it's going to be growing very quickly over a 3-month period. And it really does require to be fed. You can have, and you don't have to feed your garlic, but you will get a smaller plant. If you do want to feed your garlic, you will be rewarded with a larger plant. So regular fertilizing is beneficial, and certainly on temperatures over 12 degrees. Please don't try to feed it if you're in the middle of winter and it's only 5 degrees outside. So these plants will grow over 12 degrees, so you can fertilize them afterwards. The plant growth elements, and this is because remember we've got stages which are growth stage before we get into bulbing stage. And at that stage, we want to help those. So we're putting those fertilizers into your bed preparation. You're either going to do, your weekly liquid feed of your power feed, or maybe your Nutrox Gigantic every 3 weeks, and you're going to put that out all the way up to when it's going to transition. And this is about counting leaves when we get into this stage, because after this stage, remember, this plant's no longer trying to put on more leaves because it's only got these 2 fertile leaves that the cloves are going to develop in. It's now thinking about dying back. So we don't want to be pushing it with growth fertilizers when the poor plant wants to be bulbing. So we help it along during those early stages, but then we really want to stop feeding it those growth elements. But at the same stage, we talk about flavor and bulb quality, and flavor and bulb quality is all about micro and trace elements. So we do things like sea salt or sea mungus, which are great soil conditioners and micro and trace elements with humates. And we can continue that all the way through right up to bulbing, because that's going to improve the plant nutrition, improve the flavor, and certainly has no impact or deteriorating impact for the plant all the way through to harvest. If you're feeling really motivated, bulbing often uses a lot more potassium. And certainly from this transitioning stage onwards, we can increase the potassium by using a potassium sulfate spray, and the plant will definitely benefit from that as well. Now, as we talked about, not only is the plant growing, but from really this transitioning phase onwards is when that plant's immune system is now more compromised than it's ever been beforehand, and much more vulnerable to the different pests and diseases around the place. And this is why it's actually a really great way of thinking about this preventative product, which is a copper hydroxide. The hydroxide is a type of formulation, which means it has less copper in it, but it's more effective with the copper. And the copper is a great biocide. It's for fungal as well as bacterial. And our main issues that occur from this stage on is either leaf diseases, the garlic rust or some stem phylliums, or things that really do the purple blotch that'll get onto your garlic leaves, or it's certainly going to be any types of fusariums, the excess water diseases. And your copper hydroxide is really just a gentle and general protective and preventative treatment that we can apply from when we know that plant is going to be, before it's going to be vulnerable, right through to the end. And that won't hurt your soil, and it certainly won't hurt your plant at all. Garlic is a good copper eater. It likes coppers, and it certainly is a good protective spray in that. Now, watering is one of these questions that has to do with how much rainfall you've got. So let's just sort of tackle the elephant. Number one, when you're planting, you do need to saturate your soils when you've planted. And that means you're going to really wet them down to make sure there's lots of moisture around that clove to initiate that shooting and to be able to allow it to get those roots down into the ground with very happiness on it. If you get regular rainfall, and we're talking about a winter period, then you may not need to water at all. The soil does need to remain moist, and I'm always checking the soil. If I get a really dry winter, and people can have really dry winters, then you might need to water once every 3 days when your temperatures are below 16 degrees centigrade. If you're starting to get into warmer temperatures like 18 to 26, and again, those warm climate growings, the daytimes are going to be warm, and if there's no rainfall, you might need to water once every 2nd day just to keep those soils moist. And if you're really hot, if you get to 28 or 33 degrees, you might need to water every day to keep those soils moist. So the goal is to keep them moist, not wet, and we don't want them to dry out. If we allow our roots to dry out, they desiccate and they actually won't rehydrate and they won't survive. So, soils dry from the top down. That's why we've planted the clove lower. Obviously, the soil can dry out around the top 2 to 3 centimeters without an issue. When it starts to get dry right down around where the roots are, then we do have an issue. So we want it just moist, never saturated after we've planted our garlic cloves. And it's really about how much rainfall occurs, but you do need to monitor your soil and you do need to be prepared to go out and water. But, it's between 1 in every 3 if it's cold, or 1 in every 2 if it's warm, or 1 in every day if it's hot. But do keep it moist. That's the whole goal. We do want to keep it moist up to, and you can see when we've got these really fat layers of skin around the bulb and it's still maturing, there's no issue with actually having rainfall or watering at that stage. But when we're getting really close to harvest, we want to really be careful about our watering. And the idea is we don't want to overwater at this stage, because when it is that mature, any water that's coming in can penetrate that bulb really easily. The bulb skins are trying to dry out. The bulb is actually vulnerable to water, and so is the basal plate and the roots that are starting to dry out. So we really want to stop what we call 1 leaf before optimal harvest timing. We'll talk about what that is. And it means that we want those soils to definitely dry out around the bulb and the basal plate before we harvest. Sometimes we can't stop the rain, and that's just an issue. But if we have the ability, we just want to stop watering at least a week before harvest so that the actual roots and the bulb itself will start to dry out so they're not saturated with water when we do harvest them. Just remembering again that these are our disease periods, and that's why we want to be able to have our copper hydroxide to be able to help our plant protect our leaves and just be able to help our plant to have a little bit more protection as it's starting to mature. Now, during that stage, we will be growing hardnecks, and hardnecks do produce scapes. People often talk about when do I remove the scape, and this is just a photograph to show you. So when the scape does come up, this is obviously the bottom of the scape. This is where the umbel is, and this is called the beak, which is the extension of the umbel. And we want to allow that to come out by about 10 centimeters so that when you reach your hand in to snap it off, that you're snapping it off below the umbel. And this is where the growth stem is. And when you snap it off there, you're not going to damage the surrounding leaves, but you're going to remove that growth element, and that little stem will just dry off at that stage. When you do that, then the plant is putting all of the energy that it would put into producing the biomass of that scape back into the bulb. And it can actually make quite a significant difference. In the really what we call strongly bolting garlics, which are in the cold climate environments, it can make a difference of a ton per hectare by removing the scapes early rather than leaving them on. Here's a person that's snapping it off when the scape has completely created its full coil. You can have a look at the energy that would have been involved to create this biomass. And this is actually definitely going to make the bulb smaller because there is a lot of energy that's been put into this maturing of this scape. So certainly this is what I consider too late. And this is really an optimal stage to be able to harvest it, or to the point where it's just about to coil, anywhere between this and coiling. But know that if you leave your scape on too late, it can actually take a lot of energy away from the bulb. Now, this is a general interest because people often at this stage say, oh, I want to know how big the bulb is going to get. And there is a really easy way, and it's not a science, it's a bit of an art, which is the stem thickness, which is down the base here, has a quite good relative relationship with the bulb diameter. And so as we get up to what we call our last fertile leaf, so we need to know when the scape has come out, it means there's no more leaves. So this is when we can measure the stem, and that stem diameter down the base is directly related in many ways to the bulb size. So it's a great way of being able to estimate, and you'll see a bigger plant equals bigger bulb, but if you wanted to know, that's a really good way of being able to estimate the size of the bulb that you could get generally by the scape. Just remember that some garlics, like the Creoles, are naturally a smaller bulb to other garlics like the marbled purple stripes. So this is only a generalization. It's not an absolute accuracy, but it does help to give you that insight. So harvesting, we've talked about the plant putting on the leaves, transitioning, and then dying back. And we do talk about harvesting that's optimized by hardneck and softneck. They're very different. A hardneck only has 2 fertile leaves, a softneck has 3 fertile leaves. And that difference of only 1 fertile leaf does change the number of remaining green leaves. So the number of remaining green leaves is the number of bulb skin wrappers on the inside and the outside of the bulb. And so for hardnecks, we would typically harvest at 4.5 remaining green leaves. And if I just want to count that back, we start from the top, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this 5th leaf, we can see them in sequence. This 5th leaf, we would wait until that had died back halfway. You can see at this stage, the 6th leaf is currently dying back, and it's almost died back to the stem. The 5th leaf is actually just starting to die back slowly. So this would probably take about a week for that 6th leaf to come back, normally about a week for a leaf to die off. So that's a really good way. We just count the number of remaining green leaves. So 4.5 for a hardneck, and for a softneck, we actually want 6 to 7. And it's because they have those variable shaped bulbs and because they have those more inner clove layers. So again, we always count from the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so we can easily say, oh gosh, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves to go. 4 leaves equals 4 weeks. So it's easy to be able to judge pretty quickly, how many weeks that you've got until harvest based on the number of green leaves that have to die back for the type of garlic that you're going to be harvesting. It's always about number of remaining green leaves. Now, I just want to share with you, people say, well, how do you know? And I've done this myself, but there's a reputable IPK Gatorsleben. This is Joachim Keller who did this, and he did the correlation between the bulb development and the number of leaves. And so what an absolutely great way of being able to correlate it, showing the swelling stage to the first fertile leaf, to the second fertile leaf. And the difference you can see is the thickening and the reducing of the thickened layers of the onion layers as the cloves swell. But you can see the clove skin layer is still very thick. You can see the bulb skins are still really fleshy. And as we get through into the bulb maturity, you can see the cloves are swelling, the clove skins are starting to reduce, the bulb skins are starting to get thinner. And we'll find as we get through to the end of what we call the optimal stage, it's where we've got thin bulb skins, we've got thin clove skins, but we've still got those perfect number of outside green leaves that are going to give us good wrappers. So this is too far. You can see the bulb loosening and opening, and we've lost all of the bulb skins and we've lost the protective layers. This is a little bit too juvenile in terms of almost there, and it would certainly harvest and mature properly, but we can leave that an extra week to get through into that perfect stage. So these studies have been done with bulb maturing and correlation to leaves, and that's how we know the number of leaves as it relates to the bulb maturity. Now, if I was working with a commercial garlic grower, and I'm only sharing this, not asking you to cut your bulbs up by any means, but just to share what I do when we're working with commercial growers, is that we will plant out the cloves, the different clove sizes in different areas. So all the smalls here, mediums there, large, extra large. When we head towards the stages that we can see that there's swelling in the ground and that we want to do a monitoring, here's a medium clove and a large clove. And you can see that, this is John, I won't give you his last name, but he said, Letitia, look at the size of the bulb. But when we cut it, can you see the cloves are actually still very immature and the clove skin is still really thick. So even though this is a beautiful big bulb, even at this stage, that bulb has about 2.5 to 3 weeks worth of continued more growth before it's going to be ready. And we can do that by looking at the leaf count as well. So we look at the leaf count, but you can see very easily here that the cloves have not developed fully. We've still got really thick clove skins. We've got really thick bulb skins. Out of interest, the smaller bulb from the smaller clove is more mature than the bigger one. And in fact, that's quite normal. The smaller plants will mature earlier and faster than the larger plants will, which will take longer to mature and produce larger bulbs. And there can be a difference of anywhere from 2 to maybe 3 weeks of when a smaller clove will mature in its bulb and when the larger plants will mature. So whilst we want to always harvest everything at the same stage, if you're a commercial grower or if you're a home grower wanting to really optimize, you'd be mindful of the size of the plant and where its leaves are at and when it's going to mature, because it can make quite a big difference in there. This is a subtropical garlic. This is a Glen Large. This is a turban garlic, and it's the difference between 1 week where we've got a nice big bulb, but no color presentation on the clove skins. And 1 week later, we've got the perfect bulb and we've got a tiny bit of color coming in. And that bulb in that 1 week on average actually increased almost 10 mil in size in that last week. It does make a big difference on it. That's on the commercial side. It's just to illustrate to you that we go through this maturing stage and we can match between plant maturity and dieback versus bulb maturity. And it's a great way to be able to understand that. Different garlic in different climates also look slightly different. So here's a common turban grown in a warmer climate. This is northern New South Wales with one of my customers, and it was great that she gave me her photographs. This is in this wonderful transitional stage when we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th leaf. So we're just in that transitional stage, but it's still really clustered and really gathered like a pineapple in the bottom there. And in fact, here's a turban, one of my turbans down in cool Tasmania. You can see that it's not clustered like this. We've got this stem elongation. So, and it's a little bit less thicker leaves. She's got lovely, big, broad, thick leaves. It's very typical for a warm climate. And in cooler climates, we just don't get that type of really big, thick, coarse leaf. We get a taller plant with a slightly thinner leaves. These are both turbans. They're easy to see by this purple blushing down the bottom, which is very, very easy. And in fact, turbans have this pink, what we call the triangle on the leaf joins on the lower two leaves that we can see in a cooler climate. And we can just see that pink triangle on the bottom leaf down here. As that plant matures and bulbs, you can see, and I don't recommend the bulbs are above ground, by the way, so that's not what we should be seeing. But you can see that that dieback is very different. We've still got that clustered set of leaves at the top there, and the dieback has happened. And of course, in a cooler climate, you've got this much taller plant and this much more visible length of dieback in the plant. So, you know, again, a turban can look very different. They still are a turban. It's still by the number of remaining green leaves. So it's all very normal. They just look slightly different in the different climate environments. Once we've done that harvest, we're going to talk about the curing. And there's always a lot of questions of this. But the first thing I'd want everybody to know is that the curing is about losing 25 to 30% of its weight in moisture. It's a massive amount of water loss to be able to get down to that lovely, dormant, dried stage. But it's also the process when flavour develops. So the flavour when it's freshly harvested is completely different to when it's fully cured. And it's going to take anywhere between 4 to 7 weeks, depending on the garlic group and depending on the bulb size. Now, people say, well, how do I know when it's cured? And there's two different conditions. Number one is your outside bulb skin is going to be dry and brittle, and that happens around the 3rd week. But the final stage of curing is when the inside clove skin becomes dry and brittle. And that's the stage of where the garlic now is sealing in that clove, so that that clove is no longer going to lose any more moisture. It's now going to be stable in that dry and brittle clove, which literally very slowly allows some moisture absorption and releases a little bit of moisture, but it's very, very controlled. And that'll happen between the 4th and the 7th. There's nothing stopping you from eating the garlic beforehand. You'll just notice this was a 1 week cured bulb that I opened up just for photographing. And you can see the outside skin is dry, but the inside bulb skins are still very wet and very supple and very pliable. And the clove skin that I've taken the clove out of is still, again, very wet and very supple. So that taste would be quite greenish and sulphurish, very immature compared to what it would be when it'd be fully cured. Nothing to stop you again from eating it. It's just at this stage, it's not cured, and it would not store well if we just tried to pop this in a box and pop it away into our kitchen at this stage. So when we're curing, the first 7 days are absolutely vital, and it's because the majority of this moisture is going to be lost in the first, wants to be lost in the first 7 days. And so to do that, we need to be able to make sure that we're going to be out of direct sunlight and out of indirect sunlight, strong indirect sunlight. Perfect conditions at 18 to 30 degree temperature days. So we're out of direct and indirect. But this is the main issue that we have with a lot of curing, is that we want to be able to have a relative humidity in the air of less than 60%, ideally less than 55%. And that's because if the air is too wet, if we've got continuous wet days or high humidity, that air is already saturated with water, and the garlic can't release its moisture into air that is already saturated with moisture. It's one of the reasons as a commercial grower, I will have, my curing shed has dehumidifiers in it because I need to suck that moisture out of the air. And most commercial growers of a certain size would have heaters, fans, and dehumidifiers for that exact reason. But for home growers, we really want to try and make sure we've got that warm conditions out of direct sunlight with something of less than 60% relative humidity. And that's why most of the time that we would see people with fans trying to wick and flush that wet air away over the garlic. So we want good air circulation. We want to avoid stacking it against a wall, because when we've got things against a wall, we don't get good air circulation around it. But never, ever wash or wet your garlic after the harvest. Its entire function in that dry down before harvest is to lose moisture. We never want to reintroduce moisture afterwards. So it just, the dirt and everything else will fall off after it's been fully dried. So don't worry about the dirt on the roots or on the bulb. Definitely don't wash it down. We just want it to come out of the ground. Just rub the soil off, flick it off the roots as much as possible, but never wash it. And let it cure naturally. And that's the healthiest stage, with the roots on. One of the simple ways of doing that for a lot of people is to have even a piece of welded mesh suspended between two blocks, and be able to just pop your garlic down through the welded mesh holes so that the bulb is lovely and exposed up the top here. And if you wanted to, pop a fan on it to be able to help those bulbs lose all of those moisture on there. Now, people talk about, do we put the bulb up, bulb down? Depends on your climate. If your bulb's very wet when you harvest it, if you've had recent rainfall, or if you have high humidity, it's always better to put your bulb up and then let it hang down, because the moisture will drain out of the bulb. Rather than if it's hanging the other way down with the bulb at the bottom, the moisture drains down into the bulb and we end up with more risk and more issues with that. If you don't like the welded mesh, a lot of people end up using a lot of racks, very cheap racks available through the different hardware stores, again, where you can put that neck down. This is an example where somebody started to cut the roots off the bottom of the garlic, and that's not recommended. Roots drying on the garlic is the best way, because it actually seals the basal plate area really nicely. And if you cut that right back to the basal plate, that actually leaves this very wet, open tissue that can be infected by airborne spores. So leave the roots on. It's not going to hurt them. Never wash them. You can see the dirt on. The dirt actually helps to dry them out quicker, and the dirt will come off so easily after it's been fully cured. So don't worry about the dirt, but don't try to wash them off. Just some of the hanging racks that I use as well. So again, I put them in bunches, and I've got just mobile racks. That means I can move them around the shed, around the curing area. And I've got bunches split over the lines. And you can see those bulbs have lots of airspace. They're not washed. You can see the roots on them. You see the dirt on them. It's not an issue. This is how garlic is cured properly. You can see these are probably on the racks for 2 or 3 days by this stage. And these were freshly hung because they're still very, very green. So you can either put them on welded mesh, you can lay them out on a table, you can hang them up in bunches underneath your veranda, again, out of direct sunlight, out of indirect sunlight, and certainly make sure there's lots of ventilation around those bulbs so that that moisture can come out of the bulbs and they can dry down really quickly. It was a really long session, so I've run a couple of minutes over. Just to remind you that all of these sessions are recorded, and the last one will be uploaded onto my website, hopefully by tomorrow afternoon, by the time it's been processed and then made available. And I'm going to open up for questions. So let me just shut down this thing so we can get back into seeing each other. And I'm going to pop you across so I'm not looking to the side. Here we go. And let me bring the chat window up. Oh, we only have a couple of comments here. Hey guys. So how deep in the soil do we check for water? John Simi. Do we check for water level relative to the plant root? I call it the finger test because my finger test is actually 7 centimeters. And 7 centimeters is actually the depth to the bottom of the stem where the basal plate is. And if I stick my finger down and it's warm, it means it's dry and it's time to irrigate. And if I stick my finger down and it's cool, it means there's enough moisture there and I don't water. So, and you can tell really by the finger test, you'll normally tell really easily that you'll feel it warm at the top of your finger and then you'll feel it cool at the bottom of your finger. And that sort of tells me, oh, I don't have to water today. I can check it again tomorrow. Maybe it'll rain overnight. But it's a really simple, stick your finger down. I would say your finger test is far more accurate than any other moisture monitor that you can go and buy at any of the hardware stores. And it's such a quick thing to be able to do. I've got stubby fingers, they're really short and stubby, but the quick finger test just down into the soil is the fastest way to check if you've got moist soil, which is cool, or warm soil, which is dry. Good enough? Excellent. What have we got here? Another John. Are there any telltale signs when the plant lacks water? Yeah, the first thing is that you'll start to see little tiny yellow edges to the leaves. But to be honest, I have this philosophy about garlic, which is I want them to have this 5-star experience, which is stress-free living. And stress-free living means I'm not wanting them to get into a condition of stress before I have to alleviate that stress. I want to avoid that stress. And when they avoid it, it means that their stress levels aren't peaking and troughing all the time when they're trying to cope with the stresses. It just means that you're giving them this really premium and optimal conditions of growth, and they're optimizing their growth and their health without having to recover from stressful events all the time. So I just continually monitor. For me as a grower, I'm walking around my garlic really almost every 1 or 2 days, probably daily most of the time. And if it's not, it's every second day. So I'm just checking that, the wallabies aren't in there, or the blackbirds aren't getting the best of it, or, the swans haven't come up and sat on it. And so I'm just seeing that they're happy, they're germinating, they're up, nothing's trapped beneath the mulch. You're just monitoring. So it's not a bad thing to stick a finger in every now and again and just make sure. I don't want stress in the plants is my answer with that. Alrighty, for Glenda saying thank you, really enjoyed. Oh, lovely. Thank you, Glenda. Chris is saying, is replanting of rounds the same as a clove? And these are a reason why we got quite a large amount of rounds. Chris, can you just confirm for me, just take your mute off. Are you talking about elephant garlic now?
Yeah, I am, Letitia. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So rounds for elephant garlic happen in about 4 different conditions. They can come from a small clove, so a very small clove planted out in unsuitable conditions will produce a round. A medium-sized clove in infertile soil, so with soil that doesn't have enough nutrient for it, will create a round. A medium-sized clove that's been in too much water, so too much water, too little water, too much nutrient, too little nutrient will actually create rounds. And so if you get your nutrient right, if you get your pH right, if you get your moisture levels right, you will get less rounds. The other thing I find is that particularly for elephant garlic, it's a heavy feeder, and we often don't think about feeding garlic heavily. And so if you are growing any area of volume, I would be recommending a tissue test, which is just sending some leaves off to a laboratory to tell you what the nutritional levels are of the leaves. And then you can adjust your feeding program to really give it the ultimate. With elephant garlic, it's really hard to overfeed elephant garlic, by the way. It can be very happily overfed as long as it's a balanced range of feeding, which is not just shoving the nitrogen on, it's giving it the whole range. And also it's a very heavy feeder with calcium. So it would love to be able to have either, liquid guano is always going to be fed out on a weekly basis because it's got that lovely calcium and silica, and that really helps the elephant garlic. I will tell you, if you are a sizable grower, and this is just as a hint out of backyard growing to commercial growing, we'll often use chelated calcium all the way from 7th leaf through to bulbing with elephant garlic, and the produces much less rounds and much more divided, subdivided and evenly cloved bulbs. Now that's a commercial product, but it depends on how, master gardener you want to get. And just remember, chelated calcium for elephant garlic is an absolute boon to reduce the number of rounds and increase the bulb size and consistency of clove size. Right. Elephant garlic and rounds. Gotta love them. Roger Hurley says, what method do you use to reticulate? Or do you fertigate? I fertigate my nutrients out. So as a commercial grower, it just means that I have my irrigation lines, and if I want to put nutrients out, I actually have an injection system that goes into my irrigation that allows me to put out liquid nutrients. And it just means you can do that on a small scale at home, by the way. So fertigation systems are available on eBay for about 25, 30 bucks. It's really cheap to be able to do. It just means that I mix my nutrients up in a bucket and I walk out with my bucket to my fertigation line, turn the water on, pressurize, it's watering, and I stick the siphon in the bucket and it sucks out the nutrients and it puts it out through the irrigation. It makes it much more enjoyable as a grower to not have to use a backpack spray or to be spreading granules all the time, particularly if you've got large volumes. So fertigation is the way to go, and you can absolutely do it in your home scale garden. Absolutely. And so we've got Daniel saying, so is it okay to cut the stem before storage, making sure not to cut the roots? So we didn't talk about storage. We've got harvest, we've got curing. Curing to me is up to 7th week. And we talk about storage. So storage is when we're going to keep the garlic now for its natural dormancy, either till planting time or in the kitchen for when we're going to be eating it. I have this thing that is, the more plant mass that you can leave on the bulb, the better the storage is. And I know it's really beautiful to create a plat and to clean it down to get to that really finished, polished skin of a plat. But to be honest, it really stores much better with all of the dirt on it and all of the skins on it and as much plant mass as you can get on it. So it's really about if you want to present your garlic. And if you do want to present your garlic, then you're going to clean it down to a nice layer and trim your roots. Don't cut them off to the basil plate, just trim them. And I would almost want to leave a stem on. Did you see a photograph on my Facebook page when I had the hardnecks and I created the column of all of those bulbs with the stems, which were almost 30 centimeters long, and I bound the stems with the rope. And that way you're leaving those really long stems on. And the reason behind that is that when you have a bulb with a cut neck, that cut neck is actually where the moisture is going to get lost. So you're going to lose some dehydration in your garlic in a short cut neck, but a longer cut neck, it really stops the amount of moisture loss in that long storage period as well. So as much plant mass on as you can. You can trim the roots, just don't cut them down to the basil plate really hard, because those roots do keep and protect that basil plate area, and as much stem or as much plant mass as you can leave on is really great. Okay, and look at Ludwig, thank you. Is copper hydroxide added as a powder or as a liquid? My copper hydroxide that I use is always powder. It's Koside Blue Extra. And so I've got great big bags of it, and I obviously then just mix it up, pop it in the backpack and the sprayer, and out I go and spray it on. So mine's a powder base that I use that. I've got Fleur, hey, another Letitia. Often my leaves look like they're all dying off at the same time. Southern Glen and Glen Large in Lismore, New South Wales. And when this happens, how do you tell when it's time to harvest? That's a really good point. There are some garlic groups in some climates that don't do the sequential die-off of the bottom leaves whilst the top leaves remain green. There are some that all start to die from the tips backwards. and when you have this die back from the tip backwards to the stem, people say there could be something wrong. And to be honest, that we've got to differentiate between is that a disease behavior or is that just a normal die back behavior? And so it could be a diseased issue, but typically if the plant is healthy when you've harvested and the bulb is good, that natural die back from the leaf tips backwards is fine, but you will find it'll die from the leaf tips back, but it will also die off the lower leaves. So you will still see leaf loss from the bottom whilst the remaining leaves do start to dry back. But as long as those leaves, we talk about the pseudostem. The pseudostem is where the leaves join to this false stem and then go down around the bulb. And as long as those leaves are green on the pseudostem, then that's a tick. when a leaf dies back so that its sheath, which is where it wraps around the pseudostem, becomes brown, then that's a dead leaf. So we would always count a leaf that is still green on the pseudostem as a green leaf, even if it was starting to die back from the tip. Does that answer your question and make sense? Excellent. And Vicky says, is potassium sulfate your regular potash? It is, by the way. It's the cheapest form of potassium. There are other more expensive forms of potassium that are more foliar accessible, and you have to be very careful with them, particularly if you're using a copper as a base, because it's not compatible when you're using copper sprays. Potassium sulfate's a non-reactive form of potassium if you're using the copper hydroxides. So yes, a potassium sulfate's the one I typically use. As long as everything's going fine with my crop, I think that's a really effective and cheap form of potassium. I will tell you, I also use humates, and humates are also a wonderful form of potassium source as well. So, you know, there's lots of different forms of potassium, but certainly when I get into that transitional stage, the potassiums go out a lot, and it really does help to boost that plant and boost the bulbing size on it. Amanda says, do you use dripper sprinkler systems in your garden beds for watering? I use both. In my breeding beds, I use drippers because I don't want to wet my leaves down. That's the greatest risk for a lot of leaf diseases, is the duration of leaf wetness. But unfortunately, because I came out of broadacre, my irrigation system was a modular system of pipes and click-on sprinkler heads. And so I'd simply moved that into my seed system itself. And that was just because I'd already invested so much money in that irrigation system. It's very simple, but I have to manage when I water so that I'm managing it in the morning when there's no wind and when I know I can get leaf dryness within 2 to 3 hours. And that's the main thing with watering, particularly if you're doing overhead, is that you don't want to do it at night, which a lot of people say it's the best thing to do at night. It's not, because we want to avoid extended periods of leaf wetness. Extended periods of leaf wetness equals a whole lot of leaf diseases for garlic. And so we want to water in the mornings when we've got, you know, good sunlight and good wind and good breezes that are going to really dry off those leaves really quickly, so that we've got healthy leaves and we're not increasing the disease risk for the leaves, and certainly not a stress as well. Okay, and thank you, Cornelia. And Daniel was saying curing. What did I miss? Daniel, can you unmute yourself, and did I answer question or do we need to go back to it? Daniel was saying, okay, so it's okay to cut the stem before curing. Daniel, are you still here, Daniel? Danielle is, and I think we've got no video and no voice. So that's a different question. It's saying that when we've harvested, do we want to cut the stem after we've harvested and cure it with the cut stem? As a commercial grower, we had no choice with that. When you're harvesting 25 ton of garlic, you can't hang 25 ton of garlic in bunches. So you have to be able to cut the stem to actually cure them in the trays. But I did always leave a longer stem. My answer, though, is that I would without doubt tell you that the finish of the bulb, skin quality and bulb overall from my bunch finished curing. So when I harvest my plants, I tie them up in bunches and I split and actually cure my plants in bunches. I would say that that is about 5-fold better quality than when I broadacre produced and cut the stems at harvest. The bulbs always finished rougher when I cut the stems at harvest. And when I cure them in bunches with the plant mass on, I would tell you that the plant quality, the bulb quality, and the finish on the bulbs was so much better when they're actually plant finished. So Daniel, I would never cut the stem. By choice right now, I never cut the stems off any of my plants until they're fully cured, because I just find that the actual bulb finish is just so much nicer because of that. Okay, and I'm going to take a pause there because I've run over time, and I'm going to stop the recording just for the purpose of not making it so long. So bear with me while I do that. And for anybody who would like to leave Thank you for joining the last session. You're welcome to leave. For those who do want to stay on and have any other questions, you can certainly unmute yourselves and we can have a conversation. But for the benefit of those who'd like to leave, thank you very much for having joined us, and I hope that you've got some value out of today. So let me stop the recording and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.